Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. Today I spoke with my friend Alan, and I've known Alan for probably 5 or 6 years now. We work together at the Amazonian Plant Healing Center, the Temple of the Way of Light, and we do really similar work. He also facilitates plant medicine ceremonies there, working as a facilitator, which is kind of like a bridge between the Shipibo doctors that we work with and a lot of the guests who are coming from not only outside Peru, but really different cultures and different ways of looking at the world, and kind of acting as a bridge of bringing those two things together. He went through a similar initiatory experience working with tobacco, and he's also been living here in Peru for the last 5 or 6 years. I also am interviewing his wife, who's also a yoga teacher, who's also worked at the temple. So I have a lot of respect for Alan. He's a really good guy. He does really good work. And we've often sat down and talked for hours at the temple. So it was a really nice opportunity to sit down and to talk to him again, even in this virtual Zoom landscape. So I think you guys will really enjoy this conversation. It was fairly long, a little less than 3 hours, but he's really a wealth of wisdom. He has a lot of experience doing this work, and he shed some really beautiful insights onto this plant medicine work. We ended up talking about a bunch of things, but I think you guys will enjoy that. So if you're enjoying the show and you'd like to help out, one really easy way is if you can subscribe on YouTube. If you're already listening on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button. And if you're not, if you can go on YouTube to the Universe Within podcast channel and hit the subscribe button, that would really help in getting this show out. And also, if you can take a second and go on Apple Podcasts and leave a starred rating and a short review, that would really help to promote this podcast. So if you've already done that, thank you. And if you haven't, if you can do that, that would be a really big help. So thank you guys, and I hope you enjoy the show. All right, well, it looks like we are recording.
All right.
So Alancito, you look good.
Thanks, man. You look good too. Nice to see you. And
you got a new haircut.
yeah, I'm at a point now where it's just not looking good when I grow it. It's like thinning at the top. It kind of gets like a clown haircut. It grows on the side. So I've been doing jiu-jitsu here in Portugal, and everybody just shaves their head. So I just joined the head shaving club. It feels good, man. It's easy.
Yeah. Well, definitely for jiu-jitsu, it's makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm not at a level where I'm not competing or anything, but yeah, it's just no one can grab my hair that way. So it's good.
It's just cleaner too. Showering after, it's much easier, and
waking up, you don't even have to shower. Half the time I shower, I'm just doing it to get my hair wet. So
right.
It's easy. Yeah, it's good, man.
And the mark on your nose, is that a jiu-jitsu battle scar?
It is. Yeah. It's actually just like a little scratch that was bleeding. So yeah, I'm often paired up with this other white belt guy, and I don't know, he doesn't have much body awareness. So there's a lot of limbs flailing around when we're trying out things. And so I'm always getting kneed and elbowed in the face, but it's all right. It's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. The white belts you have to be careful with.
I know. When I'm paired up with more advanced people, they're really cool. They take it easy on me and kind of set me up to learn things, so showing me that, vulnerabilities. Like, I'm learning that my arms are always out and ready for the taking. So, but against the white belt, it's like a lot more competitive because we're both at the same level. So,
yeah. So how'd you get interested in jujitsu? What made that leap?
Well, in Wadan, so where you are now, where I've been living for the past 3 years. A good friend Chase, who you've met, is a black belt. He's a teacher, and I just, I've always been drawn to it, and I tried it out many years ago, and just the opportunity to learn from a friend who I really respect, and he was offering like a private lessons, which is just a really great opportunity. So I took that, and yeah, I was pretty quickly hooked, and now I'm continuing to do it because it just makes me feel really good. I think I noticed in the beginning just a really subtle shift in like a deep confidence. Not that as a white belt who's been training for 4 or 5 months knows much, but there's something about exposing myself to situations of confrontation that now that I've like the more I do that, the more I realize, okay, if a confrontation ever happened, which it never has in my life, but if it ever did, like it's okay. It's not the end of the world, and I'm learning something that will help keep me safe, And so yeah, there's just a subtle shift in consciousness. The first time I noticed it, I was walking down the street, I think in Cusco, and there was like a group of teenagers, like teenage boys, like 17, 16. And I've always been like kind of intimidated by teenagers because they're just kind of unpredictable, and they've got a lot of, you know, uh, uh, hormones kind of raging, and they're loud. And I just noticed there was always a part of me that was like, oh shit. And maybe I would like deviate a little bit to avoid them. And I noticed that after starting jujitsu, like that kind of, those like really subtle fears kind of dissipated a little bit. And so that was, I think it's very deep in terms of the effect on how I feel in my day-to-day life. And then not to mention the physical benefits, like just, it's really grounding for me. So I tend to get in my head a lot of mental energy. And so these kinds of like super physical activities kind of bring me back to earth. And, when I train in the morning, I just sets me up to feel really good for the rest of the day. It's a great workout. I mean, it's like, instead of lifting weights, like repetitive motions, this feels like really natural workout for the body in positions that are natural for the body. And yeah, so I feel myself getting stronger physically and kind of calming my mind and helping with a kind of deeper sense of confidence in my interaction with life. So
Our friend Felix, he sent out a funny meme. It's like a conversation between a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and the girlfriend goes, "I just bought some pepper spray," um, and the boyfriend goes, "What's that for?" And she goes, "Well, if anything ever happens when we're out," and he goes, "No, baby, take that back." And she goes, "Why?" And he goes, "I got this." And then it scrolls down, and there's a photo, and he's a white belt with one stripe.
yeah, yeah, I saw that meme. Yeah, totally. And I totally was that guy too, like, yeah, I got this. But I mean, there is something to that in that I think even with a couple stripes on the white belt, you have more training than, I don't know, 95% of the population. So,
For sure.
but that meme was really funny because I'm sure there's also an inflated sense of confidence if you don't keep it in check, like that can arise from that. So,
Well, it really is. I mean, as you probably, saw some of your early days of practicing, it's just when someone gets on you for the first time, there's this sense of panic. I mean, it's
yep,
literally like a fish out of water. Like, I don't know what to do. And it can even be a smaller person, a weaker person, but just through that experience, they dominate you. And there's this panic of, I have no idea what to do.
yep,
And that's the state most people are in if they're ever in an altercation like that. It's such a shocking thing of realizing, even if you lifted weights and you did all this stuff, and all of a sudden it's like, none of this means anything. Like,
yeah,
this person is I mean, they could kill me right now.
absolutely.
It's all at their whim, and it's a very humbling experience. And so absolutely, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. Even having one or two stripes, it's just a huge deal beginning to understand what it's actually like to be in a situation like that, where it's very rare that we're actually in in a situation where we're really like carrying someone's body weight, where we're in that situation where someone is trying to strangle us or break our arms. And I think that's the beautiful thing about jujitsu is you do that day in and day out. And it really, as you said, it brings the awareness back into the body of like what is my body? How does it work? How do I use that? How do I feel someone's weight? How do I feel that energy? And it's such a transforming thing. I'm a huge proponent of martial arts. I think especially jujitsu. It's just I think especially for young men, it's really important. But for anyone, it's such a beautiful art, and it's interesting too.
Totally.
We may have been talking about this one time. It was one of I think the Oscars, and Meryl Streep came up and she gave this speech, and it was kind of this anti-Trump speech, and she said something about, if we let this continue, then the world will be overtaken by people watching football and martial arts, which we all know are not arts. And then she like cackles, ah, ha, ha, ha. But it's like
Yeah.
it was such an arrogant statement, and
From
especially
someone who
coming
has no idea, yeah, what it is.
someone who has
Yeah.
no idea, and especially coming from someone who considers themselves an artist, but demeaning another art. And I think there's a lot of confusion about that, right? About like what martial arts is, because it truly is an art. And when you look at it, almost all of these martial arts, they were probably originally developed by monks, spiritual
Mm,
people, and it very much does become a spiritual practice. So
absolutely, man. And a funny thing happened when we got here to Portugal. That's where I am now. We're kind of here exploring, my wife Marta and I, seeing if we want to live here. And so we joined some Facebook groups, and there's one group that's like, like it's like a spiritual events community group. And on the rules for the group, it says, please no posts, no posting or invitations to activities of martial arts. And
wow.
I thought, like, from a spiritual group, so clearly, yeah, there's just no understanding, because the martial art, when it's practiced in the way it's meant to be practiced, it's a deeply spiritual practice. And uh, it's about as real as it gets, because like you mentioned, it's jujitsu, at least I can't speak for others, but jujitsu is really touching on being faced with our own mortality, and that constant reminder of like like dying, and that that can happen. And so uh, all the spiritual or psychedelic experiences, plant medicine experiences I've had, like some of the most powerful ones are the ones that brought me face to face with death, mortality, those death and rebirth experiences. And um, with jujitsu, one thing that, like, it also connects to plant medicine. I know you talk about plant medicine a lot on the podcast, and uh, a similarity that I found when I first started jujitsu, and I would, spar rolling with other people. There were several times where, like you said, I would be in that position with someone on top of me, and I'd just be struggling to get out. I start to panic, and I start breathing really heavily, and I feel like I'm going to hyperventilate. I can't breathe, and so I tap out just from the panic. So I'm not tapping out because somebody's submitting me or choking me, but because I'm just exhausted and panicked. And so I learned, and Chase really emphasizes this too, it's all about the breath. And like, no matter where I'm at uh, in jujitsu, like as I'm learning, the first important thing is to just notice my breath and how I'm breathing and how I'm present. And from there, I can make, more informed choices and decisions in the act. So when we're panicking, it's generally not the best decision-making state to be in. So I
Mhm.
think it's I think it's amazing. And yeah, to get, if more youth were involved with this, if this is something I had started in my teenage years, I think a lot of my, you know, teenage and 20s and my 20s, all the angst and that I felt, I think a lot of that wouldn't have been necessary if I had had a practice like that in my life. Uh, but yeah, it's okay. It came to me at this point for a reason, so
It's
all
funny you
good.
mentioned that. I was in Thailand. I was recommended a yoga school, and I ended up practicing there, and there were some good things about it, but there was a lot of things that I didn't resonate with. And I was also training Muay Thai at the time, and I had my first fight, and my buddy put up a flyer of the flight of the fight at the school, And I came back the next day, and someone had taken the flyer down, and someone made an announcement of something very similar, like, this kind of violence or something isn't supported at this school. And I just remember thinking, like, how insane is that? A yoga school, a quote unquote spiritual school is that divisive, and just really not understanding. And it was very funny because one of the teachers, one of his whole teachings was he would bring up the founder of Aikido, and that was what he was basing a lot of the teaching off of, which was this guy who was a martial artist. But there was a real lack of understanding. It was again kind of this pseudo spiritual understanding, saying, this guy could move faster than water, and he could like defeat five guys. And he was talking about the cities, these supposed powers you could get through practicing yoga, and he's like, this guy had developed those, and he was stronger than a human being. And I was sitting there just shaking my head because I had practiced Aikido. And I was like, no, like, you've obviously never practiced. The guy wasn't
Mm-hmm.
superhuman. It was all technique. It was repetition. It was understanding reality, leverage, human mass, speed. And it was just through these very real fundamental principles that he achieved that state. There was nothing magical about it. It wasn't some thing that one day he was going to achieve by some superhuman thing. It was very real, and it was grounded in these fundamentals, which I think is really super important with jiu-jitsu, because it really teaches you that, right? It teaches you there's realities in this world, size, mass, power, technique. These things are real, and if we don't come to terms with that, we lose. We experience very viscerally what that means to not really understand those things. And I think that's another reason martial arts is so powerful, is because it really teaches us about life. It teaches us what is
Mm-hmm.
life, what is reality, how do we flow with that, how do we understand that. And it's such a valuable teaching. I was talking with Sean about this, and
Mm-hmm.
it seems like often in this work there's kind of this airy component, this idea of spirituality as being very ethereal and in the ether and airy. And I think that's where something like jiu-jitsu is so powerful, because it very much brings you to this earth element, this reality, this fundamental, what are the things that dictate this realm that we're operating in on a day-to-day basis. So yeah.
Absolutely. It brings us back to the ground. And for people who think the world is an overly violent place, then I suggest that martial arts could cure that, because you coming out of a jiu-jitsu class, I myself feel super peaceful,
Mm-hmm.
like at peace. And it's very humbling. And I notice other martial artists seem to be super relaxed and peaceful, like people that really practice it frequently. So there's something to that, and I think it's an amazing, beautiful practice, and I'm really grateful to have it in my life. Like, and right now, especially because my life is kind of up in the air, like in terms of what Marta and I are doing, we're looking for a home, and so to have this practice that really brings me back to earth every day is super, super helpful. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Cool. So I met you in the Amazon. We do very similar work. You were working at the Amazonian Plant Healing Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. So you also, like me, you were from New York, or you were living in New York. You were also acting. What was it that initially brought you down there? Because you, I think, also like me, originally came as a guest. So what was it that really got you interested in plant medicine?
Uh, Desperation, really. It was uh, depression at the time that I couldn't seem to find an answer or healing for. I was throughout my adult life essentially kind of a cyclical depression experience where I'd get very, very deeply depressed, and it seemed to be uh, kind of getting worse into my early 30s. And so, yeah, 2014. Yeah, 2014, I was living in Los Angeles, and I kind of hit a rock bottom, I would say, of just how I felt about myself and my life. Just very, very depressed, at a very dark space, avoiding friends. I had friends who wanted to be there for me, but my my MO was to isolate in those situations. And yeah, so just having a lot of suicidal thoughts and not wanting to live. And I mean, basically, the story is a bit dramatic, but what brought me to ayahuasca is I was in LA and I was running out of money. And I told myself I was going to take all of my money, withdraw it all from an ATM, which was not much, take it to Las Vegas, and either win a bunch of money or kill myself. That was my that was my plan. I don't think I would have actually done that, but that's the kind of thinking I had at the time. And so I jumped in my car and I started driving to Las Vegas. It was nighttime, and I was maybe halfway between LA and Vegas in the middle of the desert. And I decided to pull off the road to just take a break from driving. And I stopped my car on a dirt road in the desert, and I lit a joint and I smoked it. And I sat on top of the car and I looked at the stars, and I just started to really consider my life and what it had come to, and like how I got to that place and how I felt. And in that kind of meditation with cannabis, the word ayahuasca just came into my mind. Like I was aware of ayahuasca. I learned about it many years ago. Had never done it, but in that moment of desperately seeking something, it just kind of, that thought arose, and it was very clear. And it gave me a purpose and a mission in that moment to not go to Las Vegas, but to instead turn the car back to Los Angeles and right away make arrangements to go find ayahuasca. So next morning I called my sister, asked her if she could lend me some money so I could make my way to Peru. And that's how basically 2 months later, I ended up at the temple and did my first retreat with ayahuasca. So, you know, and I think that in that, you know, we kind of have a consultation in the beginning. And if they asked me why I was there, at the time, I said depression, basically. I was seeking a cure for my depression, and I didn't really have any awareness like I do now about where that depression came from, why it was with me. I just knew that I was really, really deeply unhappy. So,
Wow. And what made you specifically choose the temple, or even Peru for that matter?
uh, well, I didn't know. I know that there have been ayahuasca ceremonies outside of Peru, even in the States, but I wasn't aware of them at the time. I had listened to podcasts where they talked about ayahuasca, and I think I had heard about the temple on a podcast, but I actually tried to go to a different center, but the dates didn't work out. So the temple ended up being my second choice. It seemed to have a good reputation, so I chose that one. And they had a 3-month program, like a work exchange program that I also signed up for because I was just ready to go deep and spend several months in the jungle. And those several months turned into quite a few years, but that's how it started. Yeah.
Hmm. So what would you say you got out of that first workshop?
I would say, to summarize that first workshop, like I don't even remember the content of the ceremonies. I just remember that a lot happened, and I realized that I and life is so much more than the story I told myself about myself, that there was so much bigger. It made it helped me to realize that the nature of my reality was determined by these stories that I told myself, thoughts. And I started to glimpse that. And I also got a glimpse about what's possible. So I would come out of some of the ceremonies just feeling so clear and so joyful and connected, and a lot of my kind of anxiety tendencies, especially around other people, would dissipate, and I felt connected. And so it gave me a glimpse of what I felt was my potential and how I could feel as a human being. And of course, like a lot of people after that first retreat, I thought, that's it. Like, this is how I'm going to feel forever. And of course, uh, a lot of the old patterns came back, but I think that initial glimpse is really was the gateway for me to continue that kind of work, and led me on a path that I'm really grateful that I found. So that's what I say that first retreat was. It was a glimpse of potential and uh, getting some self-awareness about how I caused my own suffering.
Mm. So then immediately you transitioned into a 3-month work exchange program there?
Mm. Yeah, that's correct. I finished my, so I did it was like a 1 month retreat. And then I came back a month later. I stayed in Peru and came back a month later for the 3 month program, which was essentially working a few hours a day and then doing one ceremony a week. So a slower pace of ceremonies and just kind of sitting in the jungle, and a lot of time to just reflect and be with myself in the sometimes uncomfortable environment of the jungle. So uh, yeah. And then during that time, I just really fell in love with that environment and the people who worked there. And I thought the facilitators of the retreats were just so cool. And it seemed to me they were living the dream, basically, just hosting groups in the jungle, drinking ayahuasca. It seemed like a really cool life. And my life was at a point where it was pretty open and I could make a big change. So I let them know that I was interested in doing that kind of work, and the timing was good, and they thought I would potentially be a good fit. So I spent the next several months in the jungle drinking ayahuasca a lot. That was basically the training. It was just to drink a lot of ayahuasca and follow the facilitators around and just see how they run retreats. And uh, basically 3 months later, I was facilitating my first retreat, kind of thrown in the fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was that transition like? Um, what do you think you learned, or what was the draw? What really opened you up to want to continue to do that?
Um, I think that on one level, I was really inspired by my experiences with ayahuasca and plant medicine, and it was such a mysterious world to me, and I saw the potential of how that particular plant medicine could help me. And so a desire to go deeper with it, and no better opportunity than to live at a place where they serve a lot of ayahuasca. So it was partly that, and then another element in what caused me to come to ayahuasca was I felt lost in my life. I I didn't really feel satisfied with how I was living, the work I was doing, my job. I didn't really know how I could. I basically wanted to spend my time doing something that felt meaningful, that also, could pay the bills, as they say, or provide an income. So that seemed to me like the perfect opportunity to do something that felt meaningful to me, and to also learn and continue my own healing journey with plants.
Mm-hmm. So if people aren't familiar with ayahuasca, what would you say is going on? Like what even so it's a ceremonial context, people go, they, as you said, there's a consultation, they're working with doctors, with jungle doctors, and then they're drinking this beverage. Why would someone choose to do that? What's going on? What's that experience? What is that like? um, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but if someone isn't, what is going on there? Because for a lot of people, that's very foreign.
Yeah. Well, I can say that I've probably sat in hundreds of ceremonies, and I still don't really, I don't really have an answer for that. Uh, I, I would say, why would someone drink ayahuasca? Well, it seems that everyone I've met that has come to retreats there felt kind of similar to me, a calling, just a deep yearning to work with that plant or to experience ayahuasca. Most people had heard about it. Some people had heard about it for years. Others, they just heard about it once, and something in them just pulled them and they knew they had to go to it. Uh, I would say that while it's not for everyone, there is a very deep, if, if it's held in a responsible way, there's a very large potential for very deep healing on a lot of levels. And I think if for people, I felt stuck in my life, and ayahuasca gave me some perspective. I think first and foremost, it was, this is something we would always say as facilitators, that ayahuasca is like a mirror. A lot of people came to retreats with ayahuasca for very similar reasons as me, and that reason started with just a yearning or a calling. They just felt that that's what they needed to do, whether they heard about it from someone else, or a lot of people came because of podcasts or documentaries, but just something about it drew them. And generally people come to it with some kind of intention um, for healing, some aspect, whether it's, a lot of people came for physical conditions and they heard that it helped with whatever condition they had. But the majority of people came with this kind of psycho spiritual depression or anxiety, or just feeling lost and not knowing their purpose. A lot of people come to ayahuasca looking for their purpose and just looking for clarity about who they are and what is their place in the world. I would suppose those were the reasons I came. And the experiences itself, I am, of all the people I know, I'm probably the least eloquent at describing these experiences. And half the time, I'm more focused on the outcome or the integration aspect at this point. The experiences themselves are oftentimes beyond words, and I don't even know that, I've read many accounts of ayahuasca or listened to guests in the retreat share about their experience, and sometimes it's really fascinating. I don't know how much value it actually provides to just hear about somebody's experience, because these things happen in spaces that are beyond even verbal comprehension. And so when someone's explaining it, you're not even getting what it is, because words can't do it justice. So for me, it was a mirror, like I said, and we said this a lot as facilitators, that ayahuasca is like a mirror, and that is the medicine in it for me. It gives me an opportunity to see myself, get perspective about myself, see where I have unhealthy thought patterns, or where I hold myself back, or how I am, how I interact with people, how I treat myself. It's really the best mirror I've found in terms of exploring my own psyche and patterns and thoughts, and just the stuff that in day-to-day life I forget, I stop looking at, because I'm just concerned with day-to-day life and I'm not really looking at myself. And so ayahuasca ceremonies for me are a very intimate experience where I get to sit with myself and really see. And I believe that's what it is fundamentally. Some people describe ayahuasca as a spirit, like Mother Ayahuasca, and they describe it more in terms of the medicine is giving them messages, and it's downloading information. And I don't experience it like that personally. To me, it's really just holding up a mirror to me, and helps me get in touch with a deeper sense of myself. And from that space is a clarity and a wisdom, I guess you could say, that exists. That's not mine, but it's just there. But anyways, again, I'm using a lot of words to describe something that it's hard for me to explain. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you began training as a facilitator. For
Yeah,
for people who aren't familiar, what does that mean, and why is that important?
that's a good question. What it means to me is, so I mean, there's several aspects to it. So in the format, the ceremonies that happen at the Temple of the Way of Light, they're held, by Shipibo ayahuasqueros or Onanya. So these are indigenous shamans, essentially. They're ayahuasqueros. They're trained. They're the ones basically holding the ceremony. They're singing in the ceremony. They're holding the space energetically. And one metaphor I often use is that facilitators were kind of like the flight attendants on this journey. And so helping to hold the space, helping people feel a sense of safety in the space so that they can go within and really have a deep experience. Sometimes being a facilitator in the ceremony means helping someone to the bathroom, or sometimes it means just sitting next to someone for a couple minutes if they ask for help and they just feel like they need someone next to them. It's really it's being for me it's being a presence. It's being, but without actually being an overwhelming presence. So I don't know. I would always say that when facilitators would train and they would ask me what it is, I would also say that I'm trying to provide to hold space while being invisible. My goal is to not get in the way of anything that's happening with a person, between them and their experience with the medicine, or between them and the work that the maestros, the healers, are doing with them. So it's to be as invisible as possible, while also just making sure that the space is functioning. Like that can mean helping someone to the bathroom or sitting with them or whatever needs arise. So that's in the space. Outside of the space, a lot of it is kind of just being present throughout the retreat. People have a lot of questions. Most of them I don't have answers to, but I try to reflect to them to help them find their own answers. It's also a role of being a bridge, in a way you could say, between the Shipibo healers and the guests. There is certainly a linguistic difference. Most of the guests don't speak Spanish, and the Shipibos, a lot of them don't speak Spanish very well. So there's a lot of delicate translation that sometimes happens, where we're trying to translate between a Shipibo paradigm worldview and the paradigm of the Westerner that's coming from medicine. And so there's an element of that, of just bridging and translation and communication, and basically making sure the ship gets back to port at the end of the journey. You know?
So you've been doing that for, what is it, 5 years now, something like that, facilitating?
Yeah, about, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what would you say, how have you changed? What are things that you've learned, maybe mistakes you've made, things you've learned to do better? And also maybe at this point, what are certain qualities that you consider to be really important in a facilitator?
Yeah, how I've changed. So that's a tricky question for me, because change is so gradual, and I don't necessarily remember what I was back then, but I can say that some important, like the most important thing that I learned in that journey of facilitating for my own health, physical and mental health, was that ultimately it's not up to me. And the more I facilitated, the more I actually found myself kind of trying to get out of the way or be invisible, as I said. So being there when people ask or need it, but nothing else. And the first few retreats I facilitated, I put so much pressure on myself, as if whatever I said to a person, whatever words I used, were going to be so important in determining the outcome for that person. And that basically I made it out to be a lot more than it has to be. And over time, I realized that really true lasting transformation comes when people find their own way. And so it was my intention as a facilitator at that point to, again, just in everything I'm doing throughout the retreat and how I'm interacting and how I am in the ceremony, is essentially helping people to feel like the space is held and grounded and safe, and then getting out of the way. So the more I facilitated, the less I talked, as a general rule. But I was but I was present if people needed me. So I would say the most important quality in a facilitator is that they understand that it's not their role to transform somebody else. That their role in a facilitation position is to help create a space for people to transform themselves. I think that's the most important thing I learned, and that not just for the benefit of the guests who came to retreats, but for my own just longevity in that role and energy wise, I found it to be a lot more effective and sustainable. So it's not up to me.
Mm-hmm.
That was important.
You think some of that comes just with the experience of working with these plants and really having a deep trust in them, which is just kind of realizing that they are doing what they need. And if I can get out of the way and create a space to really allow that to happen. Because it's one thing to kind
Yeah,
of have a blind
absolutely.
trust of just, oh yeah, I've
Sure.
heard this thing really works and okay, let's trust in it
Plants,
versus
yeah.
the experience of seeing hundreds, thousands of people really going through a process and coming out the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. It came from just witnessing transformation over a period of time with ayahuasca, and a trust in the plant, and especially a trust in the ayahuasqueros, the healers, the shipibos who are holding the space. That that to me is the core of that work in terms of the work that they do and their interaction with the medicine and the people who are drinking the medicine. Uh, Really, it was a trust in that, and realizing that no matter what kind of interactions I would have outside the ceremony, the core of transformation for people, the seeds were planted in ceremony and their experiences, and then it was about uh, how they took personal responsibility for those seeds and those realizations and how they brought them into their lives. And this point of view also came from my own experiences. It's like my growth and evolution in my life has happened when I've personally made decisions or I've come to realizations myself. And people can tell me something a million times, some nugget of wisdom, and it might stick a little bit, but when I come to that realization myself, that's when it's means something deeply because I see it myself, you know?
You mentioned this idea of personal responsibility, and do you think that's one of maybe the misconceptions? A lot of us, when we think of medicine work, maybe we're thinking in this more Western sense of I take a pill and it has this effect and then it fixes me and I'm good. Um, and maybe even a lot of people have that with ayahuasca, this idea that I just drink it and then I'm good, like it fixes me. But
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned something I think which is really valuable, which is this idea of personal responsibility, that it's doing something, but then there's a personal responsibility. There's a responsibility to the person then to actually take action or change themselves.
Sure, yeah. I think that element came from my own experiences where I, initially in my journey with ayahuasca, I would have really profound, beautiful experiences where I felt like I was connecting with so much clarity and wisdom and understanding about changes I needed to make or things I needed to do. And it seemed so real. And for a while I thought, okay, that's done. I don't have to do anything. Like ayahuasca has changed me. But then inevitably over time, old patterns reemerge. I go back to my old ways, my old unhealthy patterns, my old uh, habits or addictions. And the plants always showed me what's possible, but it left me to do the homework. And that's why I think it's such a valuable medicine, because it's it's allowing us to be our own teachers and healers. And that's the only way this kind of profound change can last. You can't force change on anybody. You can't tell them to change. You know, it's they have to realize. I have to realize for myself. And so that's what personal responsibility in that context means for me. It's that it's still up to me and my will, and it's not easy. And ayahuasca, I went into it thinking that I'll drink ayahuasca a few times and I'll be this different person and I'll be healed and I'll be happy for the rest of my life. it was actually kind of in some ways the opposite, because it just kept digging things up, digging deeper and deeper into my own uh, life, my consciousness, my experience, traumas, and it was it was a difficult journey for a while, and sometimes it still is. And I've drank ayahuasca hundreds of times and many other plant medicines, and I still suffer, and I still fall back into old patterns sometimes. But it was all worth it, because I'm certainly in a better place than I was when I started this journey, in terms of how I feel day to day, in terms of how I interact with life, in terms of my relationships. And it's far from perfect. Uh, but yeah, I, I'm grateful for where I'm at, you know. So the work continues. It's life is to me, life is a school, and ayahuasca is one of many teachers. And but it's a teacher that teaches me that I am my own teacher in a way too. So it's hard to explain, but basically, yeah, it's taking responsibility, because people can have. I see people, and this was me for a while, chasing huge psychedelic experiences, uh, but nothing really changes once that wears off. It's like life returns as normal. So if the only intention is just to have fun and to have our minds blown and just see some cool stuff, great. But if the intention, like it was for me, is to actually feel better and heal and live a more connected existence in this life, and feel like I'm actually living this life in a very connected way, then it takes personal responsibility.
Hmm. Can you think of any maybe common misconceptions people have about the work? Because as this work gets out there, there is a lot of information, and part of the reason actually I created this podcast was to try and shed some light maybe on what some of those misconceptions are, what this work really is from people who have been doing it. One for me that comes to mind was I was listening to one of Joe Rogan's podcasts the other day, and I have a tremendous respect for him, and I think he's actually been a really big kind of bridge keeper in a way of bringing some of this work out to the public and making it more accepted. But one thing he said, he was actually, someone was talking to him about ayahuasca, and from my understanding, he's actually never done it, but he has worked with DMT, which is, you know, one of the alkaloids in the ayahuasca brew. And he was actually saying one of the great things about DMT is it only lasts 15 minutes and you have these amazing experiences, and then that's that. And the person was saying, well, you know, with ayahuasca, often there's a lot of purging. And he's like, well, DMT is much better because you don't have to purge.
Right. Yeah.
So that was one thing that came for me, is that this idea of almost like purging is an unfortunate consequence of having to work with ayahuasca, whereas from our work as we know it, purging is actually one of the main benefits of working with ayahuasca. And from my experience, I'm sure yours as well, many people, this was actually something I experienced the first time I came and worked with ayahuasca as a guest, was it was the first time in my life where I purged, I think from taking a substance, probably other than alcohol. um, but this purge was building up, and it wasn't coming, I think, until the third or the fourth ceremony. And when I finally purged, it was actually in the night after ceremony. It was the first time in my life where I felt, you know, and it kind of as you're mentioning, it's kind of hard to put some of these things in words. But when I purged, when I vomited, it was this very visceral feeling that something was leaving me that was very dark and that was no longer serving me, and I was actually free of that. It was, you know, all of the work that I had been doing had been building up to this purge, and then finally it came out, and it was this very foreign feeling. It was a purge like I had never experienced before, and I still don't have words as to what that was. It was just after I was one in awe, I was amazed, and I was just so grateful that this thing was now out of me. So, for example, that's kind of one misconception that I see, that actually the purging is a huge part of this work, and obviously purging can happen in many ways. Sometimes it comes in vomiting, crying, all sorts of things. But can you think of any misconceptions that maybe you've seen where people come down with these ideas, and from your experience that maybe you're able to point to something deeper? I know it's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge one.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I'll just highlight the purging as well. I mean, I, the, I think the misconception comes from our mentality of Western medicine, where some medications have these negative side effects, and purging is like viewed as a negative side effect. And until you purge in an ayahuasca ceremony, um, and a lot of healers that I've talked to, Shipibo ayahuasqueros, they're essentially saying that for them, one of the key elements of drinking ayahuasca is the cleaning. They call it cleaning, the purging. And purging can happen, it's not necessarily vomiting, you know, it can happen multiple ways. And for them, so this ties into, I think, one misconception is placing an over amount of importance on visions, the psychedelic visions. And again, you know, in my conversations with Shipibo healers, like, they don't place much importance on those visions at all. For them, that's not what's important. What's important is the cleaning, the clearing, the alignment of the mind, body, spirit that happens when working with this medicine. And I've seen a lot of people, including myself, coming with this expectation to just see visions, to see dragons and snakes and whatever else, aliens. And a lot of that expectation comes from reading or watching documentaries online, and it seems like the only people that write about ayahuasca or make videos are the ones that had the most dramatic visual experiences. And so that's one. And I learned very quickly that I had some very, very profound experiences that there was not really any visions at all. It was it's hard to explain, but it was felt, it was experienced, and but not really seen in that space. That came as well at times. So yeah, an over importance placed on visions. I would also say a lot of people come with a really profound fear that they're going to go crazy. It's like a biggest fear, and I had that fear too. And again, I think this comes from how ayahuasca is talked about in media. So the only time you're going to read news about ayahuasca is pretty much when something bad happens. Some guy goes crazy, and you know, there was the story, I think it was last year, the Canadian guy who shot and killed a maestra in the jungle. And again, if ayahuasca is worked with responsibly, it's not for everyone, and there are certain contraindications like medications and certain drugs and other contraindications. But it's it and if someone has, you know, preconditions like bipolar, schizophrenia, these are other conditions that are generally not to be mixed with ayahuasca. But yeah, that fear of going crazy, of losing it, is mostly totally unfounded. And that said, I went with that fear, and one of the very positive experiences I had was actually working through that and seeing where that came from. So it's basically, for me, it was a fear of losing control, right? I learned a lot about that, and a lot about letting go of control, or the illusion of control. And then another one I would say is this was also true for me. I thought, if I don't go crazy, I'm going to turn into like a airy fairy, like hippie person, like, because I associated those people with ayahuasca or psychedelics, and I thought it was going to possibly turn me into someone else, when in actuality it just made me more myself. So
You mentioned this word. You mentioned words medicine and drugs, and I think there's a lot of confusion around these terms. Um, I mean, it's interesting because even where we come from in the States, drugs has a very bad connotation, and yet I think I forget the statistic, but I think the average American who's middle aged is on 5 drugs. It's just 5 prescription drugs or 5 legal
Wow.
drugs. Um, there's there's a drugstore in almost every few blocks in a major city. We don't call them drugstores anymore. We call them pharmacies. Here in Peru, you go to any city, and it's literally every block. There's a drugstore. There's a
Yeah.
pharmacy. So, what are these misconceptions? Where do you think they come from? These words like medicine or drugs, or
Mm.
I mean, what is? It seems like there's so much confusion around that, and there's so much stigma. Uh, I mean, even that difference, that those two words, they have such a different connotation, and yet at the end of the day, they are the same thing. And yet,
Hmm.
some drugs we would label as very bad, and others we would label as life saving. I mean,
Hmm.
transformational. They've saved literally billions of people, things like penicillin and antibiotics. And
Hmm. Yeah. I only started calling it ayahuasca medicine because that's just what everyone called it in the circle of people and working at the retreat center. But I would say that, there's two things there. It's one is, I think for the most part, what we consider, what's considered drugs in our culture, at least, is something that intoxicates a person so they can escape reality. Uh, I think basically that's what it means. Whereas, and there's also with drugs, there's often a connection with addiction. And so something to escape reality by being intoxicated. Whereas when I think of medicine, I think of something that addresses root. It, it also comes down to intention, but medicine to me is something that can address root causes of suffering. And rather than, while there is a temporary intoxication, the outcome is actually a greater clarity and a greater connection to who I am. So it's almost the anti-intoxicant. It's the opposite. A lot of what I witnessed working in ceremonies, watching people work with medicine, people would come with a background of a lot of drug use and abuse and addiction. And they would often go through a very physical process of purging that, of literally cleaning those uh, physical and non-physical energies out of their body. Uh, and so in that sense, it's a detoxifier. So medicine is something that really clears me out, brings me back to who I am, and helps me to become more clear about myself and life. So to me, that's the difference in terms of drugs and medicine. There's also an intention, though, intentional difference. I could drink ayahuasca and treat it like a drug. So although I don't know how that would work, but basically drink it with the intention to escape. Um, I don't think it wouldn't really do the trick. But when I drink it with intention of it being medicine, if I call it that for myself, and when I take that cup and I drink it down, and I'm calling it medicine for myself, then I'm also setting myself up to sit with the discomfort, sometimes extreme discomfort of an ayahuasca experience. Sometimes it's blissful, but when it's really difficult, it's helpful for me to have context calling it a medicine, because then it gives a purpose and a reason for the dark visions, or the just discomfort in my body, or the fear that might arise, or the sadness, or whatever emotions that it can bring up. If it's a drug, then fear, sadness, and discomfort in my body means the drug isn't working very well.
mm, yeah. So, from your experience, how would you say ayahuasca is working? I mean, you have your own experience of what you've gone through, but now having facilitated so many people, do you see certain patterns that are happening? I mean, often, as you mentioned, the Shipibo have a certain way of looking at what's happening. There's a process of cleaning, clearing, aligning, you said. Uh, what would you say is actually happening? And obviously, you also mentioned this idea that it's very personal. But having said that
Yeah,
it's personal, what do you think is actually happening? Because I'm sure you've also noticed certain patterns or archetypes as a facilitator, seeing things that people are going to. and they're going through, and there's also a certain trust that arises from that because you've seen that in the past, and so you kind of have a sense of, oh, like I see what they're going through, like I've seen this before of how this medicine is working.
Yeah, for me, if I were to summarize what ayahuasca is doing, to me, ayahuasca is a liquefied plant consciousness. So it seems to me that plants are conscious beings, and by drinking ayahuasca, I am connecting with the potential to experience a plant consciousness, and what that is exactly. Um, I think plants don't think about themselves. They don't have neuroses. They're present, and they grow towards the light, and they root into the earth. So as far as an example of someone I want to live like, uh, plants really, I think, set a pretty great example. They don't cause themselves unnecessary suffering like we do. And so ayahuasca, to me, if I look back at all my experiences with it, it's like I'm drinking this plant consciousness, and in order for me to experience it, the plant starts to just clear out everything from my body and my mind. So there's this process of cleaning and clearing, whether it's toxins from the body or emotions that are blocked, trauma, thought patterns, programs that are not helpful to my existence. And there's this process of clearing that out, and sometimes the clearing that out comes in the form of actually experiencing those emotions as they come up, or seeing my fear that I've actually have always had always been a part of me, and but really experiencing it really viscerally. So that's the fear coming up. And so there's this process of just getting all this stuff out of the way, this toxic elements of my existence, physical, emotional, mental, uh, in order to bring me to a presence, I would say. That's, I guess, the plant consciousness, the way I see it, is presence. It's here now, without all the neurotic thinking and the striving and the needing. And um, and there have been ayahuasca ceremonies where I've had it feels like a glimpse of that experience. And in that experience, my mind would come back in and say, oh, this is it. This is presence. So obviously, but just these spacious moments. And for me, that's what this medicine is pointing towards, what it's always pointed towards for myself. And when I say it's a mirror, it's showing me and helping me to release everything that is in the way, or every way in which I'm keeping myself out of that presence, that pure present state awareness. And I don't know if I'll ever be fully present, but I've certainly feel more present. If that's another change I can express in my 10 years since, or whatever, 7 years since I started working with plants, there is a greater sense of presence. I do still get lost in my mind at times, but uh, that's, if I could summarize what it's doing for me, that's what it is. And I think people have different ways of explaining that, and I'm not even the best person to say what it's doing, uh, but that's what it means to me. So
A really common question that people often have is, well, I guess first, would you recommend that someone drinks ayahuasca on their own? Second part of that is, if the answer is no, obviously the way you've been working is in this ceremonial space with curanderos, shamans, doctors. What is the role of that doctor? Why is it important? And what do you think they're really doing?
The first question, would I recommend that someone drink on their own?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, as a rule of thumb, if someone I didn't know came up to me and said, should I drink on my own? And I had to give a yes or no answer, I would say no. Uh, I don't advise it for, I mean, it's not up to me anyway, but I don't think it's a good idea uh, for most people. But there might be people out there where I've heard people say that they drank on their own the first time and they had a very profound experience, and they seem okay to me. So I don't know. But I think for most people, it's ideal and it's best and it's safest because to first experience this plant in a setting, in an environment that is held. And by held, I mean by people who have trained and learned and worked with this medicine for a very long time in their lives, and even going back in a lineage of people that they learned from. It provides a direction and a safety, and it facilitates a process of going inwards with without being encumbered or distracted by having to. If I drink ayahuasca by myself, I've got to worry about if I don't know if I hear noise from the neighbors, or is someone going to knock on the door. You know, these little worries, those can all go away. And then the what the Shipibo healers are doing, I mean, that's a whole nother universe that I I I'm not a good person to explain that. You know, I've explained it hundreds of times in ayahuasca retreats because that's part of, you know, when people get there, they want to understand what they're doing, and a lot of it can't be understood. But and it's been a while since I've even talked about it, so I need to sit with it for a moment. But what they're doing essentially is, I think that they are, to summarize it, they are working with intention, and they're guiding intention, and in their case for healing, and they're directing intention for the purpose of healing. And how they direct that intention is based on what they perceive is going on with the person that they're working with. And the way that they work is by singing caros, which are, I mean, medicine songs, but it's much more than a song. Uh, but they are perceiving what's going on with the person and in the space and in their world, and they're singing to it with intention of healing. And what healing is, it seems, is again this facilitation of a process for people to let go of that which does not serve, to clean and clear and their body, mind, and spirit, and align themselves with the present moment. Yeah. But the technicalities of it was something that was always and continues to be difficult for me to explain because I don't fully understand it. You know, they're singing in a language that I don't understand, and there are other facilitators who have really gone down that path of learning from Shipibos and that have a much deeper understanding of the. It's a technical. I mean, it's an art form, but it's a very, in my view, a very technical work that they're doing. They're like surgeons, and I don't understand it enough to even begin to try to explain it. All I can say is that experiencing it can be very powerful and very much felt. So to drink ayahuasca by myself versus to have someone intentionally working with me and facilitating that process in a way that I can't even describe is a huge, huge difference. It's like being left to my own devices to who knows what'll happen versus to have someone who's there and present and working with me. Very different. And I think in the long run, if someone were to just drink by themselves versus in the long run drink with a skilled and well-intentioned ayahuasquero or ayahuasquera, the outcome would be very different and probably a lot more positive and long lasting, I would imagine, if they work with someone.
So at a certain point, you became interested in tobacco. How did that start?
Well, that started, so right after I facilitated my first retreat at the temple, and it was a month-long retreat, and it was really hard for me. I I was completely drained, physically, emotionally, psychologically. It was I just in, invested. So I was really tired and drained. And a good friend, a mutual friend of ours, Vlad, had just started dieting with our mutual teacher. He did a tobacco diet, and he had just come back from that. And I saw Vlad, and he said he did this diet, and there was just something about Vlad and the way he was that I just felt that's what I need. Whatever he's got going on there, that's what I need. There was just this sense, I can't explain it, just a real grounded clarity that I perceived in him that I really wanted in my life, because I felt really ungrounded and unclear and tired. So then I visited for a consultation our teacher Ernesto, and asked him if I could diet tobacco with him, and he said yes. And I just got a really good feeling, like a good vibes from him. So I just went into it. I did my first diet, and it was basically, I would say, the first true initiation process of my life, and it led me on a long journey with tobacco. But it was very profound and very, very healing medicine for me. It brought me back to earth after drinking a lot of ayahuasca and facilitating retreats without really having any self-care, like taking care of myself. And the medicine of tobacco was just what the doctor ordered for me at that point. And that first diet just awakened something in me, and I really wanted to continue healing primarily, and also learning from that lineage of tobacco medicine. And so I began the process of diets, which I know you've talked about in another podcast, but the journey of dieting was a huge process, transformational process for me as well.
So how would you describe tobacco as medicine, and what was that process of dieting like for you?
So how would I describe tobacco as medicine? Well, I think you did an amazing job of describing it on your tobacco episode. I was talking with Vlad, and he mentioned, and I agree, like, people ask me about tobacco, I'm just going to refer them to your podcast. Um, for me, tobacco is the of the most powerful medicine that I've come across for the purposes of cleaning my body and my mind and bringing me back to earth. So there's a very grounding element to it for me, and getting me out of my head into presence. Yeah. And if I could describe tobacco with like more of a physical description, tobacco to me is like, it's like that. It's just like, I'm like this, and I have tobacco, and it helps like just bring me back. Like this kind of alignment and centering, and bringing me to my center and grounding, especially drinking it. And so in the tradition that you and I have both learned from. So I find it to be a medicine of, yeah, I think alignment is a key word, grounding, and cleaning, cleaning the blood, cleaning the whole system, and cleaning the mind too. After I work with tobacco, after I drink tobacco, after I diet tobacco, there is certainly a sense of clarity in the mind, and not so much chatter Like it really quiets that down for me. Sometimes by activating it to the extreme, and then the aftermath is a quiet that I really very much appreciate.
Hmm. And what was that process of dieting like for you?
Mm. Well, briefly, it was again this metaphor of the mirror. It was because most of the time in the diet is sitting with myself. Is, you know, you drink the medicine once a day, but the actual process of drinking is just a fraction of what the entire day is. So um, it's, to me, it was really getting to know myself and getting to see my patterns and my thought patterns. So on one level, just bringing this continued self-awareness and understanding how it is that uh, I disconnect myself, or how it is that I allow my mind to get in the way, in a way, like not using the mind as a tool, but rather being a slave to it. Really showed me that. And and then there's another element of diets that's just more of a felt sense that I didn't have before diets, but I've gotten from the diets, and that's just a sense of um, just really being here in my body. Uh, I learned a lot about, that I can't even explain, just about energy and how I am and how I hold myself, and just this sense that I'm really here and present and embodied. There's an embodiment that came from that process of dieting, um, that to this day I experience, and I forget that I experience it because it's my experience now, but it's certainly not something that I felt before that. And that has continued. It's been a couple years since my last diet that I did, probably. Yeah. So,
And also, I think you had mentioned the first time or the first few times you drank it, it was very difficult for you, yeah?
yeah. Yeah, it was, that's why, I said that first diet was like probably the first true initiation of my life, because uh, in that first diet I drank, it was 7 days, and drank tobacco each of those days. And probably 5 or 6 out of those 7 days, I really thought it felt like I was going to die. It was the most physically challenging experience of my life. And, and like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast with jujitsu, bringing us, face to face with our mortality, those experiences were a reminder of my own mortality, and really feeling like I was looking at death. In retrospect, I knew that, my teacher, Ernesto, was holding it and he knew what he was doing. But I also know tobacco can be lethal in a really high dose of drinking it. And so it was extremely powerful, and it cleared me out like it was a reset button in a way. And the fascinating thing about it was it's not psychedelic. So before tobacco, I often associated this idea of reset and death and rebirth as a psychedelic experience, right? This wasn't psychedelic in the way that we think about psychedelics, but it was absolutely. It brought me into a state that I've never been in before. Uh, and to summarize it, it's, yeah, like, what is an initiation? To me, initiation is about facing our mortality. That reminder is so important because it helps to clear out a lot of the trivial concerns that that I have, that keep me from living a present life. So there's nothing like facing death to bring us back into the moment. And that's what those initial experiences with tobacco were like. I mean, there was
Yeah.
more to it, but there was
Yeah.
also dreams and all of that. So
When I was running diets at the temple, Valco, one of the my coworker who was doing that, we shot a video with Ernesto, and he was saying that really the process of becoming a curandero, of a doctor, is a process of death, and it's a process of dying many times. And you mentioned that, obviously that's something he's mentioned. It's very common really in any shamanic path. They really talk about this idea of death. Uh, Ayahuasca, it's a Quechua name, and one of the translations is vine of the dead.
Right.
You've also worked with Iboga, which maybe we'll get into a little bit later. And traditionally that's done in two ceremonies, the death ceremony and the rebirth ceremony. Why, I mean, you've kind of touched on it, but why do you think that's such, not only a common theme, but it seems to be the theme amongst all of these plant medicines, is actually this idea of death, of dying, which for many people it sounds crazy. It's like that's the thing I want to put off the longest. That's why I'm here. I'm trying to live my life, and that's the last thing that I want to do, even to the point of I don't want to think about it. We do so many things even to avoid not only thinking about it, but trying to prolong that as long as we can. And yet these plants, this shamanic work, it seems that that's actually the key, is dying. They often talk about it in Tibetan Buddhism, that they would say that the point of the practice is to die before you die. So you touched on it a bit, but is there anything else that maybe you can point to as to why that's such a fundamental aspect of this work?
Yeah, I mean, that's really crucial, and it's a great observation. I hadn't really pondered it very much, but it's so true. And I think on one level, it's remembering death and getting really intimate with that aspect. Uh, like I said, is medicine in itself. A lot of my suffering in my life, maybe all of it, has actually come, if I really boil it down, to forgetting my own mortality and getting caught up with stories and thoughts and experiences that cause me suffering. And there's always, I've read books or heard stories about, the like corporate CEO who like worked his ass off for 30 years, and then he learns that he has terminal cancer and he's got 3 months to live. I think there's several books about this, but I read one years ago. And basically, once he knew he had 3 months to live, those last 3 months were the best years of his life, moments of his life, in terms of doing what he always wanted to do, telling people, his loved ones, how he really felt, expressing that love, um, uh, uh, doing, creative projects, arts, all the things that he realized that what he came here to do, what he wanted to do with his life. And I think if everyone remembered their mortality, I think we'd see people living very different lives and doing very different things with their time. And so that's very healing. And I suppose the other aspect of why these traditions and plants always point to death is because, if just not speaking about the physical body's death, but death of the ego, the thinking mind, the sense of this is I am Alan, that that's also a big source of suffering when there's an unhealthy ego. And so when that dies, we're not actually dying physically, but that is a death. And it's an opportunity for unhealthy identities to die with the help of these plants, and to then rebirth, an identity that is still connected to the previous identity, but perhaps with maybe just a little bit less of the negativity or the elements that cause suffering. So I suppose that a lot of this death is in a sense symbolic, or it's more related to the death of the mind and the ego. Not that not the mind, but the ego, the dialogue in the mind, the part that's always narrating. That's I think it's great when that dies once in a while, or multiple times. It's been very helpful for me to have those experiences. So, and it just seems to come back a little bit more connected, a little bit better, a little bit happier, and then, but it's a process.
You mentioned this idea of one of the biggest fears you see that people have when they come down is this idea of going crazy. And someone said it really well once. Maybe it was Eckhart Tolle, but he was saying, for example, if we were to see a schizophrenic walking down the street, we realize that they're unwell. They're just constantly voicing all of these things, and yet he was saying that we're all schizophrenic. I mean, that's almost the nature of the mind. We just don't necessarily
Yeah,
verbalize it, and and
yeah,
one of the common things that I've seen, I'm sure you've seen, is, and you mentioned this idea of one of the things ayahuasca was doing was kind of detaching yourself from these stories of the mind, this constant chatter, and bringing you to a space of presence. And you mentioned this idea of ego, that's the ego. It's this voice in the head. Why do you think that's such a big thing? What, like, obviously everyone has thoughts, and I would say many people realize that those are thoughts. Some people probably don't even realize there's just this real
yeah.
attachment to that thought is me. And obviously, it seems like some of this work is beginning to create a detachment from that, as you said, bringing back to presence. So, what would you say about the ego? Obviously, you're mentioning this process of dying, the ego dying. Um, is it just simply getting to a place of presence? Is it beginning to create space around the thoughts, realizing that these thoughts aren't me, realizing that they are just stories? Do you feel like there's an eventual lessening of that chatter, or is it just a realizing that that chatter is not me, and coming back to this presence? What do you think is kind of the balance of that?
Yeah. So, and I don't want to. I think there's a tendency, like in spirituality, quote unquote, to for people to kind of poo-poo the ego or say the ego is a bad thing. And I've seen many people come to ayahuasca and their intention is for their ego to die, to basically, yeah, have an ego death. Uh, for me, at least, my experience is the ego is kind of necessary, at least in my life, to navigate this world. Uh, what plant medicine has done for me, like another metaphor I can use is that plant medicine has been my favorite meditation teacher, in that it's shown me that I am not. I've had glimpses of I am not those thoughts. That's not who I am in the ultimate sense. And when I die, those will not continue. And so I still get caught up in my head. I still get stressed out over little things once in a while. I still notice negative stories happening. Uh, but there has been a reinforcement or of perception, that it's not me, that none of it's true. Really, none of my wife, actually, when we first met, one of the reasons I fell in love with her is she said she didn't believe a single thing her mind said. And I thought that blew my mind, but just saying that and and hearing that, and then having these experiences with plants, and realizing that I can choose to only listen to that voice, or I can also choose to remember, that especially when it's causing me suffering, that it's not true. And it's not so easy for me to just drop the thoughts and to be done with it, especially unhealthy, negative thought patterns. Part of my journey, I've learned a lot about trauma on journey, my own trauma, and through my own experience, and realizing how much of this these thinking patterns and the negativity and the different, really like different voices in my head. It sounds like a crazy person, but I think we all experience that. And but a lot of them started in childhood, and so it's really a process. They've been there my whole life, like narrating the show, narrating this life, and a lot of them are no longer helpful for me. So I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but um, you know, just briefly, a realization for me is that, you know, I came to ayahuasca, I said, because of depression. I didn't know why. Well, it became very clear to me with time why a lot of that depression was there. And is, you know, an early trauma of my life is my mother died when I was 4 years old. And through various medicine experiences, I received a lot of clarity about how that impacted my sense of self, my identity, and how these different narrators emerge from that experience that are actually there in the moment trying to protect me. And but they stuck around even into adulthood when I didn't need them anymore, but they're still there. And it led me to withdraw from life, to protect myself, to avoid going through that pain again in various ways, whether it's through avoiding people, through never living in one place for more than a couple years and moving from place to place, whether through substance abuse, you know, moments of that, but just escaping and avoiding and hiding. Uh, and so, so I guess my point is, I experience my ego as just this concoction of different experiences in my life that have created these different kind of narrators of my experience. And a key for me to really realize what they actually are and that they're not true is to understand where some of them have come from and how they started and where they emerged from in my life. And seeing that has helped me to start to get space from them. And some of them I can say have gradually essentially disappeared because they no longer had a purpose for me. So uh, so plants specifically have given me a lot of space and awareness of those aspects of ego, of my ego, I should say.
Mhm. So I know one of the other plants you worked with, which has had a really profound effect on you, is iboga.
Hmm.
How did you come to that?
Well, it came to me. I mean, it was brought to the the temple of the Way of Light, where we were working. There was a break where there were no retreats running, and there was a small like iboga retreat essentially organized for those of us that worked there that wanted to participate. So uh, I didn't really know much about it other than I was really scared of it. So kind of the same fears I had for ayahuasca originally, I had for iboga, because I heard people can die from it, and I heard uh, just that it can be really hard, and heard stories that iboga is like a really like strict, stern father. You know, people characterize these medicines of, you know, different archetypes. Uh, but yeah, it came, and I went for it, and it was another one of those kind of initiation experiences, several of them. And yeah, after the first time doing it, I was just really curious, and it impacted me in a very profound way. And so I continued uh, on a journey with that over several years, but working with it multiple times. Yeah.
From my experience working with it, and it seems like something a lot of people relay, which you were talking about, is this idea that it really shows you these thought patterns that have
Mm.
kind of been running almost in the background since who knows how long, maybe since childhood. Was that something you experienced too?
Yes, I would say iboga is the plant medicine that showed me the most about the nature of trauma in me. And so yeah, it's so hard to explain, but I had multiple experiences, one in particular, or two in particular, that um, I was basically brought back to experiencing the moment I found out my mother died when I was 4. And just like all the feelings of hearing that that had happened, and realizing that my mother was dead. And it brought me back to that. It not not in like a visual sense. I wasn't back in that place where my dad told me, but I just felt all those feelings. And the essential like feeling was just, I mean, it was horrific. It was, like I'm laughing. I can laugh now, but realizing I never understood how much that impacted me until Iboga, and it brought me back to that experience of finding out my mother died. And I realized that I had been holding that my whole life, and essentially I had been living my life seeing like through the lens of that experience. And so obviously that impacted me in many ways. And by bringing me back to that experience, I saw that I was seeing through, it's like we don't see reality as it is. Or I don't, at least. I see it through lenses based on my past experiences. And this lens from that traumatic moment was there, and I never even realized it in Iboga. Through that experience, I saw it. And it's been a process of integrating that for quite a while, but just a real understanding of the impact of trauma, how it affects from the body all the way to the mind, and how that colored my entire experience, my whole life. And then it made me realize that everybody in life is just seeing through their lenses, however their experience has been colored. Yeah, that was just a profound understanding for me, and it's been very impactful. It's been a journey to integrate those experiences with Iboga, but that's, I suppose, what I could point to is what I learned from those experiences, and I'm still kind of integrating it. I still don't fully understand it. It's quite a powerful one for me. So
Would you say all of these plants, we've talked about ayahuasca, tobacco, iboga. I know you've also worked with San Pedro, Wachuma. Would you say they're all essentially getting at the same thing? They just have different ways of working, or
yeah,
are they very different plants?
someone once said it like they're all shining a light on the same thing, just from a different angles is one way to look at it. I think that people respond to different plant medicines differently. So, I've talked to people who didn't respond well to Iboga or didn't feel that it was useful for them at all. I've talked to people who drink ayahuasca and they don't feel like anything happens for them. There's probably a lot to dig into there, but I do think they're essentially all pointing to the same thing, which is what's in the way of presence, basically. And yeah, and I've responded well to most of them. So whether it's San Pedro, ayahuasca, iboga, I mean, I find them all to be helpful in their own way. And I can't point to any particular one as the best or most helpful. And, yeah, they've all been really, really helpful teachers and healers on my own path. So, uh, yeah.
The two words that are often used to describe these plants, I mean, there's plant medicine, but maybe more of the technical terms. One is psychedelic, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of means that the mind made manifest or the mind revealed, or sometimes they're called entheogens, the getting access to the God within.
Mm-hmm.
Um, would you categorize them that way? Do you think they are medicines of the mind, or getting access to this concept of the God within? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And God within, I mean, what that means to me is glimpses of getting with these plants and glimpses of my own interconnection with everything, and also just wisdom and clarity that it's hard to explain, but I would also call that the God within. So, I'll absolutely listen to that aspect of me more than I would the mind and the thoughts if I had a choice at all times. But I think those are totally fair and characterizations or descriptions of what these medicines are when they're used with that intention as being medicines. So absolutely. I think, for a lot of my life, I believed in some God out there, like, in the sky. And then I realized that I don't see that, so it must not exist. And then with plants, actually initially with psilocybin and mushrooms, in my early 20s, it was a realization that God isn't out there, and it's not some other place. It's like here and now. And I would say that those psychedelics are opportunities, or they provide us with an opportunity to see that and remember that it's nowhere else but right here and right now. And yeah, so a lot of people, I think, are on a path of seeking it, like trying to find it, but I think it's just here and now.
Mm.
Sometimes.
A lot of these, I mean, you're talking about ayahuasca. Obviously, the way we're working with it, it's in a very ceremonial context. There's a lot of tradition around it. The tobacco we've been working with, very, very long tradition around it, very specific process. Iboga, highly ritualized, very ceremonial, a very specific lineage of how it's worked. It seems like a lot of these plants now, there's been this real resurgence of these plants as medicine, beginning to study now ayahuasca, beginning to study psilocybin. Johns Hopkins has done a tremendous amount of research, Imperial College in London, studying things like MDMA, ibogaine. There's a growing number of clinics and a lot of research showing that the benefit of treating addictions. And what are your thoughts on that? Is it kind of a necessary way that this work begins to advance? Is isolating these things, or do you also think there's something really lost in these rituals and the traditions that is an integral part of that work? And maybe how do you see those eventually coming together, or is it just two very different fields, or is it
Yeah,
the same thing?
That's a big one. So I certainly value the ritual aspect behind the traditions that have worked with these plants for a very long time. I think they're there for a reason and a purpose, and we could talk about that too. But I think that the way that the Western world or the modern world operates, in order, like if we want to see plant medicines readily available to people who don't have the time or don't have the money or resources to fly across the world, then in order for them to be legally available, they have to go through this process that currently exists in our modern world. And that's a process where scientific study is viewed as the ultimate authority in regards to medicine and health and what can be legalized. And so, I see the importance of it. I don't think it's necessary in terms of me. I don't need any data about ayahuasca or iboga. And when people talk about the technicalities of what it's doing in the brain and the serotonin receptors and the alkaloids, like, that's pretty much over my head, to tell you the truth. I mean, I can regurgitate some of that information, but it doesn't matter to me. However, I think that perhaps this is a necessary step in the process to make them more available. Um, However, I also think that it's not necessarily a great thing for them to be easily available everywhere. Just, you know, my experience of seeing what it takes to skillfully uh, hold space for someone with these medicines, or what the shipibos are doing. I mean, that's not something you can just train someone on an online seminar in a couple hours and then have them serve ayahuasca to people. Um, I see a potential for, if something like that is legalized, that actually the reputation of these plants being really harmed, because you just see more stories of reckless use of them, and people who have psychological conditions using them, or people mixing them with other substances. So that's something to work out. I'm a, I'm a, I think the ritual aspect is important. For example, if I were to just take some ayahuasca or tobacco, for example, and just drink some tobacco with no intention and no particular reason, but just to casually drink it and then try to go about my day, I'll probably have a really terrible, uncomfortable experience. What the ritual does for me is it creates it I guess it brings the intention into a physical dimension. It really solidifies the intention of it. It brings context and intention and structure to something that can often feel, without it, totally unstructured and without context and really scary. And so to bring that aspect to it, I think is really crucial. I'm open to new rituals forming if they work. I mean, I don't think it's absolutely necessary to stick to all these old ways. However, a lot of these ritual and traditions have existed for a very long time, and they've survived, I think, for a good reason, because they serve a purpose and they work in those contexts. But I think that's, for me at least, if I see plant medicine or psychedelics start to be available on a larger setting in the world, I would sincerely hope that some aspect or an important aspect of that ritual is maintained. That it's not just a clinical administering of these things. Like um, maybe a clinical setting can become ritualized as well, but the way I imagine a clinical setting, I don't see it very being very helpful to the process of working with plants. Yeah, I haven't thought about that much, but I think the ritual is important to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like a lot of these rituals, there's so much that goes behind it. Working with ayahuasca or iboga, there's tobacco, there's very strict dietary requirements,
Mm-hmm.
maybe periods of isolation, the icaros in ayahuasca, or I mean, something that I really felt with iboga was actually the music. I really felt like the music was somehow taking me into a loop of these mind patterns, and actually without that, it wouldn't have been the same experience. Um, so yeah.
Absolutely. In those iboga retreats, when the music is so important, and they say in Africa that music came from iboga. So it's the music of the plant. And there were moments in my experiences with iboga where the music would stop. Like, so uh, in a couple settings they were playing the music on speakers, and then in Africa they would do it live. But when the music stopped, I mean, I felt the boga, the way it was working, would just kind of stop. And uh, to me, it was such an important like guide of the experience. It's crucial, and you can't. That's a ritual that you can't invent a new one of that. That is I don't know how long that ritual has existed, but the complexity of that music and how it's evolved over a period of very, very long time, that's essential to me. And it's incredibly powerful. That music alone is really powerful. So it's unlike any music I've ever heard. It's fascinating. Whole nother topic, but yeah.
Mhm. So where are you at in your life right now? I mean, obviously this work here in Peru, it's been shut down since March. It's probably not going to open until maybe March of 2021. I know you're spending time in Europe now. How do you see your life moving forward? Do you have any ideas, or it's all kind of a big mystery right now?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery right now. A lot of changes, obviously, I think for pretty much everybody, have happened this year and unexpected. And my wife and I have decided to. We've been living in Peru. You know, I've been in Peru for five, no, 6 years now, and we decided to make a change to come to Europe. My Marta is from here, and uh, so I feel like I'm kind of reinventing myself here. Um, I don't know where it's going. I I'm still connected, you know, to the temple of the Way of Light, and when it does reopen, I still see myself being involved with that center, and I'm still working with plant medicines in terms of for myself or holding space for others with tobacco and San Pedro. So I see those continuing to be a part of my life. But right now, aside from that, and we have an idea of where we're going to live. But aside from that, I don't know where it's going. I also know I like jujitsu. Um, but this year's been a huge teaching for me about uncertainty and that it actually always exists. Nothing is certain. And I thought I had it all figured out, you know, and I knew where it was going, and that's totally been, you know, the rug has been ripped out from under me. So, uh, and that was hard at first, but now I'm starting to embrace it. I'm actually really excited, and I just don't know where it's going, to tell you the truth. I know that we're going to live in Europe, so
You think this whole pandemic is going to create more of a demand for this kind of work?
here, I'm just going to shift out of the sun a little bit. Yeah, well, I would say so. I think if sure, I mean, people I've talked to, friends I've talked to, this whole pandemic and everything that has come with it has really stirred up a lot for people that I've noticed. I think a lot of people are struggling. Friends of mine struggling, just who have been. Some of them are still kind of locked up in their house, afraid to go out. So yes, I think that there will always be a demand for healing and a need for it. And I think especially after this past year, I envision people will be even more so looking for the healing that they can connect with through plant medicine. Yeah.
Hmm. Now you're in Portugal right now. Is that one
Hmm.
of the advantages of living there? Is that a lot of this work is decriminalized and there's opportunity to work with plants there?
Yeah. Yeah. So everything is decriminalized here, but a lot of people interpret that as it means it's illegal, and it doesn't mean that. So essentially, if you get caught with any sort of illegal substance, and plant medicines are pretty much all illegal here, technically, um, it just means you won't go to jail, you won't get in trouble. But you're not allowed to technically sell them, and as far as I know, you're not allowed to like serve them in a ceremony. But it happens a lot here in Portugal. There seems to be a lot of people doing that kind of work here. So, and it seems like a pretty laid back kind of laissez-faire kind of culture here. So, um, yeah, but we've decided to live for now. We're going to start out in Germany, in Berlin. So, uh, but Portugal is certainly a wonderful place that we might live here in the future if it works out. But for now, Berlin is where we're going.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
what's the draw there? Just close to family, and there's there's
Yeah.
there's opportunity there, and
Yeah. Opportunity close to my wife's family. So they're from Poland, but just 2 hours from Berlin. I think just the accessibility. So uh, living in Portugal or being in Portugal, we've realized that you absolutely need a car here, and Marta doesn't drive, and we have some friends, but they're all scattered all over the place. And to us, this is a great place if and when we are ready and we can buy land. And you know, this would be a great place to have land, like to create our own life and essentially in land. Berlin is a great place for now because it seems like we can actually integrate into life there pretty quickly. It's just a very well put together city. I mean, it's Germany, it's organized, there's public transport, so we can actually live outside the city, like in the forest or in nature in a more rural area, but be in Berlin within an hour, and all the opportunities that that provides. And there's a really nice community of people that we know. And we've just learned like the importance to us of community, of after living in Waran, where you are now, realize how important it is to be surrounded by friends and people that that you can count on, that can help you in times of need, and you can connect with and bond with. That's a pretty unique, amazing gift in Waran, in a place like that. So we're also looking for a place where we can have community of people that we connect with, that are easy to get to and hang out with. So Berlin has that for us right now.
So with this whole pandemic, do you have any thoughts on it? Any strong feelings? Do you have any thoughts of why it's happening or where it's going, or is it just completely no idea?
Yeah, yeah, probably a lot of no idea. My observations about it, you know, I'm just observing a lot of things with it. And, you know, a couple observations is, without really judging it really, but seeing, I, I see two extreme responses to it from people. And on one end, I see people very, with a lot of fear, and trying to do everything that they can to avoid getting this virus. And then on the other side, people who really, I like, don't, a lot of people don't even believe it's a thing. Or there's just so much, there's so many different mindsets that have emerged from this, and it brings out a lot in people. um, and I think a lot of people are tired of it. It's it's also shown me the nature of media, and how media plays a role in everything, and my perceptions about what's going on. It's, yeah, I mean, there's so many layers and levels, but I think it's just like stirring up a lot, and it's bringing a lot to the surface in terms of people's personal experiences, and also in the world at large, of just what's happening in the world. Things are bubbling to the surface. That's my perception right now. Um, it's been interesting traveling in the middle of this pandemic. So I was in Africa when it started, and then I managed to evacuate and get repatriated to the United States, where I'm from. And then I managed to get repatriated from the States to Peru, where I'm a resident. And then I managed to get repatriated from Peru to Europe, where my wife is from. So I probably traveled more than most people in this pandemic. And, you know, usually when I travel, I mean, firstly, I just notice how different every place is and different cultures are. And this time when I travel, it's like, I see the same thing. I see people wearing masks, and like that becomes like what I really see is just the masks. And in every country, people, I see this dichotomy of response, of either really being afraid and, you know, seeing people driving their car by themselves wearing a mask, or people sitting on the beach by themselves wearing a mask. And then on the other side of it, I see people gathering at bars and being in close proximity and just like not a care in the world. So it just seems so like there's just a real divide in terms of how people are responding to it. And that exists everywhere. In Germany, in Berlin, people are protesting about how this pandemic is, they feel, bringing an infringement on their personal freedoms. So there's huge protests, and obviously in the States, that kind of thing is happening. So it's a really fascinating time, man.
You were part of
Personally,
it, or you were at
yeah,
the protest in Berlin, yeah?
no,
I know you
no,
weren't.
I just, no, I didn't. I think we were actually in Poland at that moment visiting Marta's family. So we just saw footage and read about it, but it was a big deal. And when it happened, I thought, firstly, I thought, wow, you guys are protesting. Like, you should go to Peru and see what like what they have to deal with there. Because in Berlin, when we first got there, for a minute, I forgot about the pandemic, because in the streets, no one's wearing masks. Restaurants are full. You just have to wear a mask when you go in the shops. And most people in Berlin are just living their life as if nothing was happening, as far as I can tell. And so I thought, like, what are they even protesting? But, um, I talked to people and understood that in Germany, I think there's a real sensitivity to this type of uh, infringement on what people perceive as their personal freedom, and that's based on the history. So based on communism on one side, and fascism, and a lot of uh, just a lot of the messiness of the past and the regimes that were there. So people are really now hypersensitive and aware, and trying to keep that at bay, which actually I really appreciate, that valuing of their own personal freedoms. Yeah.
The American in you's coming out.
Yeah, dude. Well, you've our conversations, man, have played a big role in that. Like, I think I've learned a lot from you over the years, and just our conversations when sitting at dinner in the jungle. And um, yeah, and you've brought that out of me, like, that aspect that I appreciate, the principles on which my country that I was born in was founded, and I think this is something I've been thinking about a lot, actually. It's those principles, I think, are very much, for me at least, aligned with what I've learned, or the values that I've gotten from plant medicine experiences, like a respect for, and a value placed on personal freedom, personal responsibility, uh, um, all these ideals that the founders of the United States put forth. And I know there's a lot of talk now that they themselves weren't living up to them. And to me, that's, yeah, sure, they're human beings, but the fact that they put those down on paper as something to strive towards, I think, is amazing. And I think it's super important. And I think that's what I like about the United States. And I think that's what's important. And rather than, now there's so much focus on what's wrong and what's been wrong and what was wrong, and forgetting that, to me, uh, the patriot in me, at least, likes to focus on those ideals, and like this continuous striving and desire to move towards, like, attaining that, living that. And that's the personal journey of my life. It's like, if my life had a purpose, it's to learn, evolve, and grow towards the most ideal version of myself, to the most connected and present and person who feels love, and uh, that's what keeps me going. So if I were to translate that into a country, as a whole, I think that there's kind of a similarity, to me at least, in the ideals set forth by the founders of the United States. So
I think that's
does that
something
make
really
sense?
important. You mentioned this idea that plant work really has taught you that. And obviously, who knows? As you said, I mean, maybe it's just bringing up these things because they're already inside you. There's a certain social conditioning.
Sure.
So that's certainly a possibility. That's something I've thought about too. But also, when I look at more traditional societies, I actually do seem to see those principles as well. And I mean, even, you mentioned this idea of plant work and taking personal responsibility. You mentioned this idea of holding the mirror up to ourselves. And certainly for me, that's something I've seen, not just in my own process, but really more so through the observation of other people that I worked with. And it seems like that is something which is also what makes plant work so difficult, because it's
Mm-hmm.
so easy and natural in a way to say, this is why I'm suffering, and we point the finger out and we say it
Yeah.
was this person's fault, or it's because I was born in this circumstance, or it's because this thing didn't happen to me, it's because my mother didn't love me, or because this happened. And there's truth to that. It's not to say that those things aren't important. They are. They're real. They're vital. They've formed us. But also, as long as we're holding on to those, we in a way
Yeah.
become our own jailers. We maintain that cage around us. And it's very difficult to look into the mirror. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that was
Mm-hmm.
something that I really saw in my early ayahuasca ceremonies, where all of these things where I was judging other people, it held the mirror up and it said, hey, wait, you do that same thing. So
Mm-hmm.
how can I judge someone else when I do the same thing? And it's
Yeah.
so much
Yeah.
harder when we actually go inward and we see all of those areas where we do the exact same thing. And it may not
Mm-hmm.
be exactly the same. Maybe someone killed my family member, and maybe I haven't literally killed someone's family, but I may have those thoughts. I
Mm-hmm.
may have those same emotions inside me that want to do that. And it becomes very difficult when we, I think, begin to go on that journey and see that we carry all of those things. All of the
Mm-hmm.
violence that's in the world is it's in us. And unless we come to
Mm-hmm.
terms with it in ourselves, it's it
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 never ends.
it never ends. And there's often this saying, I mean, Lao Tzu, I think, put it really well, allegedly, if he said that. But, if we want to end the darkness in the world, we have to end the darkness in ourselves, because
Mm-hmm.
literally the darkness in the world is our own darkness. It's not even like this idea of the mind body connection, right? They're not separate. Anything that's happening in the world, it's a result of me. And
Mm-hmm.
that's very hard for people to hear. It takes a very strong person to say, okay, I do that too. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's actually something really beautiful that jujitsu teaches also, is also that idea of, if someone beats me, it's not their fault.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not because they're bigger or stronger, they practice more. I mean, all of those things are real. But the only way out of that is I have to change. I have to improve. I have to do the
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is. So, I mean, I felt that same way. I mean, I think these ideals that the United States are built on, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
everything happens in a time and a place, and we can never remove ourselves from that. And it's very easy to judge things from the past.
Yeah.
But again, even if we look at ourselves, I mean, if I was to judge myself when I was a teenager, I did all sorts of shitty things. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it, I mean, that's also the thing. I mean, to imagine life 500 years ago, it's almost impossible to imagine
Totally.
who people were, what people were going through. I mean, even we look at something like politics 20 years ago, it was very different. I mean, the mentality that people had. So I think this idea, it's very easy to judge and to bring
Mm-hmm.
up the bad. But that also seems to me like really a part of this plant work is actually, how do I hold up that mirror, and how do I go inside myself? And I think
Mm-hmm.
we see that in spiritual traditions all over the world, right? I mean, that was the Buddha's journey. It
Mm-hmm.
was constantly holding up that mirror and eventually sitting under a tree and going through every level of his own demons, his own desires, his own projections, and having to come to terms with that. It was that journey within, that self-reflection. And yeah, so that just seems to me something, when you said that very much resonates. Is I really think that I think this plant work, there is a correlation to a lot of these fundamental principles of
Mm-hmm.
autonomy, self-responsibility, liberty, and why these things
Mm-hmm.
actually are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, I think this, especially now, it feels so important. These that teaching and what you're talking about, and I'm just witnessing at a distance, what's happening in the United States, and just the division there, how divided it is. And it's been a journey in myself of realizing that I too, like, there's this judgmental side emerging about these situations. And but I just wonder, you know, I often think about like, what would it like, how do we get past that? Like I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that. Like for me, you know, all this would go away if everyone just stopped telling themselves stories about themselves and everyone else. So like literally it blows my mind that actually something that is doesn't actually exist in physical reality, it's not a thing, it's nothing, is the thing that would resolve all of this, and that's thoughts and stories. And if we just take them away, like it's all of it's done, the division is done.
Mm-hmm.
It maybe that doesn't sound crazy to someone else, but to me that just blows, that's amazing that it's simply that that I perceive is dividing. It's just my story versus yours, and what I believe versus what you believe. But yeah, I'm just wondering, like, I don't think that everybody is going to start drinking plant medicine, and the plant medicine isn't for everybody. And it's just one of many paths. But yeah, I just wonder, like, there's a part of me, an idealist in me that would love to see this just magically just resolve and heal, and everyone comes together, you know. But I don't know what that's going to take, or if that's even necessary, or if all of this that's happening in the world is again it's exactly what's going on within me. It's like my personal journey is expressed in all of humanity. It's the same, like you said, it's the same thing. It's yeah.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I mean, I think
what do we
that's.
do, man?
We also mentioned this idea of these founding principles that the
Mm-hmm.
country was built upon, and I think that's something that I think is really important, and that we really get lost. And it's something I saw in the coronavirus too. Is, you know, what are my principles? What are your principles? Because it's very easy in the face of a storm to get taken, to get, you know, swayed by the wind, by the emotion, by what people are saying. But if we have principle, then we actually have something to stand upon.
Yeah.
When we say no, my freedom of expression is a principle. It's a God-given right. It's not something someone gave me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamental principle that I hold to be true, whether an asteroid hits, whether it rains for 5 days, whether it's the most beautiful day. That principle is universal. And I
Mm-hmm.
also think that that's something that plant medicine really points us towards, are actually these universal principles. I think it's something jujitsu does a beautiful job in, is
Mm-hmm.
also pointing us back to these fundamental principles. And I think even if we look in time, all of the heroes, or the people we really admire, people like Martin Luther King, Gandhi,
Mm-hmm.
for a long time the founding fathers of the United States, people like Mother Teresa. I think the thing that actually unites them is they have this principle, you know, and their principles may vary, but they have a fundamental principle, whether it's Martin Luther King saying we all need to be judged on our character rather than on how we look, or Mother Teresa's principle of helping all people, no matter what caste they're in, or the founding fathers saying you have a God-given right to your liberty, to your freedom, to your pursuit of happiness. And I
Mm-hmm.
think if we really believe in these principles, then we actually have a ground to stand on. We have something to fight for. And it's really
Mm-hmm.
easy to get carried away in these storms. It's really easy to look at all of the things that are wrong, or all of the examples of where it may be good to sway from those principles, because it's really easy to get caught in that wave. Uh, but if we stand on that principle and we realize that that principle is true, you know, something like the freedom of speech, you know, that,
Mm-hmm.
do we believe in that? And if the answer is yes, then we have to fight for that principle. Even when something comes along, and, you know, you were mentioning in Berlin that a lot of the media coverage was, oh, it was full of Nazis. But if you believe in freedom of speech, then you have to fight for the Nazi. You have to fight for any and every idea, because the principle is that once someone begins to stop that, even I think we can all 99.9% of the world agree that Nazism is bad.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't hold on to that principle of freedom of speech, then we begin to get away from that principle. We say, well,
Mm-hmm.
there's actually I or someone else can control that in the name of supposed good. But the consequence of that is then we actually get away from the good. There's a beautiful quote in the
Mm-hmm.
Tao Te Ching, which says, if you let go of the common good and the good becomes as common as grass, because as long as we hold on to that idea that I know what's good, or I can control what's good, or my good is better than your good, that's the road to hell. Because
Yeah.
eventually someone comes for my good, someone comes for my beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have that principle of what's actually important, what's actually true, then that can actually be something that unites us. That we come together and we
Mm-hmm.
stand for this principle. We can disagree on things, we can disagree in name and form and shape and color, but we can stand together in this principle that every life is important, that every viewpoint, someone is entitled to that, that we don't have to fight each other on these things. We can respect that, we can disagree, we can create the world that we want to see, and someone else can create the world they want to see. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very difficult for people because, as we've seen in the plant work, we hold on to that belief so strongly because it becomes our identity.
Mm-hmm.
I am Jason who believes in this, and that's my whole identity. And for me, I think that's also part of the death experience of these plant medicines, is when those begin to die away, it's the scariest thing.
Yeah.
Because then who am I? I'm
Yeah.
nobody, right? I,
Mm-hmm.
I, I literally, when we take it to the most extreme level, even every cell of my body begins to go away, and we're standing in nothingness. And we
Mm-hmm.
project all of this terror onto that, the fear of a never-ending eternity where there's this aloneness and desolation and just fear and terror. And I think that's the root of it. It comes down to this fear of, when I begin to let these things go, it's the scariest thing, because then who am I? And then I
Mm-hmm.
actually have to go into that rabbit hole of, who am I beyond name and form? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the scariest journey we can take. And so, yeah, I think all of these things that we're experiencing in the world are really just a projection of that, of all of the
Mm-hmm.
things we're still holding on to, that actually somehow seemingly give us some stability, but actually those things have to crumble away before we're actually ready to go into that journey. So
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, like, uh, God or God within, universe within, like, I love the name of your podcast, by the way, but do you think that that is an essential piece to having a healthy human society, like like a spirituality? Because I asked that question because I also perceive that it seems whenever that is lost, and I don't know if it's the cause or not, but things tend to go awry. Things tend to go off in societies, and even in the United States. I mean, it's very complex, but I think it's related to this remembrance of our own mortality, and to me, that is also very much connected with my spirituality, my my understanding or belief. I think it's more of an understanding for me that I am not God, that this ego of mine is actually not, is nothing. You know, when I remember that, I remember that. And without that remembrance, when uh, ego is the ruler of a person and that is their God, then they fight to the death to defend a story, an idea. Um, and yeah, it seems to me that lack of spiritual awareness or understanding leads to a lot of problems. It doesn't work. That there has to be some way, and you don't even have to call it God. I think there's ways to describe this that don't have to be perceived as God in the way that people think of God, but rather that my minds, my ego, these stories are ultimately not true. So yeah, I'm just curious about, this is something I've thought about too, and I'm just especially observing what's happening in our native country, you know, and if that's an important piece of it.
Well, I think it's very interesting because I think one thing we see a lot in the work we do is people come down and they really idealize, for example, the Shipibo or curanderos, doctors, and that they have this kind of omnipotence and this all-knowing quality, and I
Mm-hmm.
think they project a lot of things onto them, and some of those are true, and yet they're very human, and it's also interesting because I think I would say the vast majority of people, like if we're looking at it in a more American context, the vast majority of the people we work with, they're very, I would say, left-leaning people, liberal people, because I think there's actually there's more of a potential openness to this work. Who am I? Just a curiosity. But I always think one of the things that's really interesting is actually from my experience, most of the Shipibo, they probably fall more on the conservative side of
Yeah.
things. You know, they have these very conservative values, family, spirituality, some sort of practice, a discipline. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think like many things, like a pendulum, you know, these things switch back and forth or they swing back and forth. And we go maybe to these more liberal ideas because it's very important. We're fighting something, or we're fighting against something that was very oppressive in a way. And yet any of those ideas, if taken to an extreme, then they become extreme in themselves. They actually become out of balance. And so we have to then take those things back to the center, and then often it goes the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you said is really vital. I think so many of us, we've gotten away to some degree for good reason from things like churches and religions, this sense of independence and I don't need anything and science has all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
But the danger in that is we actually get away from something that's almost certainly fundamental to human health, which is this idea of spirituality, which is this idea of spirit, of getting
Mm-hmm.
connected to something that's deeper in myself, that isn't just a material manifestation. That, like you were saying, the corporate CEOs, we can we can get all these material possessions and have the nicest iPhone and be the most liberal, open-minded person and do all of these things and think all of these good thoughts. But also, as we've seen from our work, those are often a lot of the people who are suffering the most
Mm-hmm.
because there's actually something in them that's not rooted, that's not grounded. And there's something that's gotten away from this sense of something that's bigger than myself, that actually the world isn't just about me and my beliefs and what I think and what I think other people should do. And there's something beyond that. And I think coming back to that idea of spirituality or religion is actually there's a reason why that has existed in all of humanity, because to a large degree it was very healthy. There was something in that practice or in that faith, because even that word has become very almost dirty for a lot of us, this idea of faith or belief.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even probably, similarly to you or to myself or a lot of people who come to this work, there's often maybe more of this quality of atheism or against spirituality or against religion, but maybe some vague notion of spirituality, of God. But I think a really common thing that we've seen is that when people begin to go really deep into this work, they somehow become more,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily like the word spiritual, but even these ideas of faith,
Mm-hmm.
they become really key. That there's a faith that someone has. There's a, I don't know even if belief is the right word, but there's just there's a deep sense of something that's greater than ourselves at work. As you said, like this work can't be put into words. It's beyond words. It's not something that's material, and there's really no way to describe it until one goes into that experience. And
Mm-hmm.
and the only way to kind of describe it is something beyond words, and it's something internal, which is just this faith, which I think really helps, as you said, to bring someone into presence, which brings someone into a groundedness, which I think is also the maybe one of the antidotes to a lot of what's going on in the world is, can I be grounded? Can I be present? Can I listen to someone? Can I not agree with them, but can I still be present? uh, I go on Facebook sometimes, and I see almost like this celebration of like, oh, I defriended this person, or ha ha ha, I never have to listen to this person again.
Mm.
And there's an extreme disconnect in that. There's a division. There's a sense of I'm right and I know more than this person.
Yeah.
And
I can just cancel out whoever isn't right to
right,
me. Just
right.
ban them. Right.
And also something
Yeah.
that this work
I,
has really pointed to me, and I've said this a number of times, but when I see someone who's really gone deeply into this work, and I think from your experience, you can also sense that when someone is really connected to this work, there's two qualities that I often see in that person, and one is a sense of gratitude, and the other is a humility. And that humility is something that's very important, and I think that's synonymous with wisdom, is realizing that maybe I don't know, that there's another side to this thing. And actually, the only way that I can gain that wisdom is to see things from the other side.
yeah.
That's the only way that I can bring balance, that I can find harmony, is I have to understand the other side. And when I do understand the other side, a lot of those projections and those judgments, they begin to fall away. I actually see the human in that person. I see where they're coming from. And I mean, this is a big thing in relationships, or really anything, is I think I know what the other person knows, or I think I know what they mean, but I really never can, unless I really share that experience with them, or we share together. It's just an idea. I have no idea what
Hmm.
that person is actually experiencing in life. And that bridging together really brings a harmony to that. And again, going back to jujitsu, I think that's something that's really valuable in jujitsu is, as you said, it actually brings peace, through that physicality, through that trying to kill someone, trying to choke someone out. You're
Trying
left
not to die.
trying not to die. You're
Mhm.
left with a peace, and you're actually left with, even though this guy is trying to choke you out, at the end of that, that guy is your brother. There's
Mhm.
something that's shared in that moment where he's expressing himself fully and you're expressing yourself fully, and the stakes are extremely high. And even if he wins or you win, there's a humility that comes with that. There's a sense of peace, of connection, of this guy, I could have literally just killed him. He could have just killed me, but he didn't, because we're actually trying to get at the same thing. And in the end, it brings those two people together in the
Mhm.
most amazing way.
Absolutely, man. Like I thought about this with jujitsu too, and it's to me there's something so honest about it, and honest in the sense like so with all the division in the world, like it's really people's stories and perceptions competing with one another, and whatever they subscribe to, they're competing. I'm right, you're wrong. And jujitsu, and so anyway, that's a competition of words, and people start to hate each other, and they actually do sometimes kill each other over that. In jujitsu, it's like skipping the words and actually getting down to um, this conflict. And on the other side of it is two people who don't want to kill each other, and uh, I don't know, I've had experiences of sparring or rolling where at the end of it, somebody submits you, me pretty much every time, but like we're both like just kind of tired and exhausted, and we just like look at each other, and there's just this love, like this connection, because we went all the way through this conflict to the inevitable outcome where in a real situation my arm would have been broken or I could have been killed, and then but it didn't happen. And I don't, there's just something about it that's so honest. And it's like every time I practice jujitsu and I spar with someone and I go through that, it's, it helps me to realize that the nature of humanity and that everybody else is exactly the same of me because all the stories are put aside. Um, it, I guess this is hard to verbalize. And then just on the topic of spirituality, you know, one way I look at the world is that everybody is looking for God, whether they acknowledge it or would call it that or not, but everybody is looking for something else to look to, something else to give power to give meaning to, something greater than themselves. For a lot of people, that's a political cause. For some people, that's an athlete or a movie star or a president, and these, or a drug, an escape. And all of these, especially when we idealize a cause or another person, eventually it leads to disappointment, because if it's a person I'm idealizing, like, eventually they'll fuck up, or I'll see, or that they're actually human. um, if if it's a cause, the same thing, I'll start, at least for me, I'll start to think about the flaws in that argument, and I'll start to see it from the other side, like you mentioned. And so uh, with these experiences of like facing death with plant medicine, it's the realization that there's nothing that I can give, that I can fully give my faith to, including myself, except for God, a higher power, something that is beyond me or any other human being. And um, I see that also when you look at societies that have failed, it's the ones that also forget God and place all of their, give all their power to people, governments, to control, to organize, to do everything for them, or leaders that end up, being, dictators or whatever it is, to give it all to them. Eventually it collapses, because people are people, and everybody's just like you and me at the end of the day, and we die, and our stories just don't hold up at the end of the day. So I just, that's just a reflection I've had a lot recently. I'm just really fascinated in observing, like, with, like, societies, why they work, why they fail, what happens, and what's important and what's valuable and what's needed in order for a society to continue to thrive and function. And for me, what I perceive is that in my own experience, my I can only give faith to God and what God is for me. Nothing else is ultimately perfect.
Mhm. And I think there's also part of this idea of wisdom, again, seeing things from the other side. And I think there's
Yeah.
often kind of like the hero's journey of having to leave home to actually really realize why home is so important. And, um, certainly that's an opportunity we've had. I mean, it's been a sacrifice too, and a blessing, but being away from home, living in another land, working with different people, I think there is an inevitable wisdom that arises from that, of seeing the beauty in other people, seeing the beauty in other cultures, but then also seeing the things that maybe they're not doing right, the things that are out of alignment, and really beginning to realize again these principles, like what is important, what's important for me, what are what are the beauty of the places that we've come from, and how do we improve those, how do we hold on to what's good, and bring also this experience from the other side as well. And um, so yeah.
Yeah, man. And at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter what society or country you live in. Even the most oppressive regime, at the end of the day, it's a personal journey within, and freedom is found within, right? So I've heard of people going to prison and having these awakening experiences in a jail cell.
Mm.
Uh, so that's a testament that it's not about the world outside me or anybody out there. It's all about this journey within, uh, and realizing that freedom is also within, in a way. Yeah, it is, absolutely. So uh, yeah, man.
Well, cool. So you also, I just realized, have a podcast with Felix. Do
Yeah.
you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. We started a podcast pretty recently. It's called Beyond Words. The title is essentially, I mean, a lot of what we talk about similar themes to what you and I have discussed today. But it's basically free flowing conversations between myself and Felix. Um, Felix, has Felix been on your podcast?
No, but he's
No.
supposed to come on soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's also someone who, uh, I met in this world of plant medicine, and he has a very, I'll be fascinated to hear your podcast with him because his experience with ayahuasca and actually learning in the Shipibo tradition. Um, but anyway, he's someone who's gone really deep on that path, and we just have conversations about life, about our experiences, what's going on for us in our life, or what's going on in the world, and how we perceive these these things through the lens of plant medicine. And yeah, it's a conversational podcast, and we do it about once a week. So Beyond Words with Felix and Alan, and it is on Spotify and iTunes and a few other places, but those are the keys.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Well, cool, man. Anything else you can think of to get into?
Um, I mean, dude, I think you and I could just get into it forever, but right now, I mean, no, nothing. I don't feel any urgency. So about anything, I've really loved where we've gone with this, and yeah, it's always great talking to you. Like I said, conversations with you have been really instrumental in my own life, like just in opening my mind to ideas or possibilities that I had never even considered. So, uh, yeah, I really appreciate that, man. And you also led me to read the Tao Te Ching and start to just connect with that and what it is. And that's been instrumental in my life as well. So, yeah, I think it's great. And I love that you're doing this podcast. I think it's really amazing. So, keep it up.
Oh, well, cheers, man. I appreciate it. And we'll have to do it again when you get to Berlin and get settled in. Maybe some new things open up. And yeah, there's so much we could talk about. So
Totally, man. I'll do it anytime.
yeah, cool, brother. Well, I appreciate it. And good luck with Portugal and your move back to Berlin and Marta. And it's sometimes it can be a little frightening, this unknown possibility, but it can
Yeah.
be really exciting too. So I'm sure you guys are going to settle in really well.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I'm learning to see the excitement of the possibilities. So,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks, and hopefully I'll see you soon in Peru when we get back there to get our stuff. So,
Yeah. Cool, brother. Well, I appreciate it so
all
much, and
right,
I'll talk to you soon.
all right. Talk to you soon. Have a nice day.
So that's it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. I have some good guests coming up. I'm not sure the exact order, but hopefully I'll be talking to my friend Felix, who also is a plant practitioner. He does a lot of work. He's worked with Spibo for a really long time, and he's really just gone very deep down that path, and he has a lot of information to share. Hopefully I'll be talking to my friend and colleague Marav, who works with tobacco, and she's really amazing, does great work, and also really just a wealth of information. I'm trying to get Leela back on, who I spoke to in one of the earlier podcasts, to kind of go more deeply into the work she does, how she does it. Also, another Spibo who I work with named Damian. He's also a curandero. We're trying to get him back on, and I'll have Carolina back on as the translator. His signal's a little bad, so we're trying to figure out how to do that best. And then also coming up is Marta, who is actually Alan's wife. We did a podcast that's delayed a little bit, but I'll release that in early October with her talking about yoga and plant medicine, and it was a really good podcast. So thank you guys all for the support. Thank you for turning in. If you are able to help to give back, to help to continue to promote and to grow this show, Patreon is a really good way. You can donate for as little as $1 a month. There's a few different tiers: $1, $3, $7, and that really helps to keep the show going. As probably a lot of you know, a lot of the work we're doing, really all of it, has been shut down since March. So that really helps to support me and to support this show. So to everyone who has donated, thank you so much. And if you're able to do that and willing, that would be deeply appreciated. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.
Tum